What's up everyone? Welcome to another card advantage video. Dynasty release is in full swing, and in today's video we're going to be looking at Sandscour Greatbow, the new bow at the center of the aim counter mechanic and synergy that we got in this set. Death Dealer has been the most commonly used bow in Azalea up until now. We're not going to be really talking about Lexi in this one, so we're going to be looking at Greatbow in the context of Azalea's card pool and seeing how it holds up against Death Dealer. Before we jump in, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe and comment if you want us to analyze other new cards from the set or other mechanics or gameplay strategies. So let's hop in. One of the best things you can do when analyzing a brand new card like we have with Sandscour Greatbow is compare it to an existing card that's already being used for a hero. Today's video in context of Azalea, we have Death Dealer. Death Dealer is a once per turn action that nets you an entire card for the cost of one resource, and it loads your arrow into Arsenal. To compare and contrast Death Dealer and Sandscour Greatbow, we're going to look at a common turn cycle you could have with Death Dealer, and then after that we're going to look at how you can be utilizing Sandscour Greatbow and getting the most value out of it. At the end, we're going to compare the value of the two and see if that could inform a decision on whether Sandscour Greatbow would be worth building around. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to lay out a common scenario that you might approach with Death Dealer. We have a tunic counter on 3, and we have Searing Shot in hand. We blocked with 3 cards, and we have Release the Tension on top of the deck. So we're going to use the tunic counter to load the Searing Shot in Arsenal. That's going to be using Death Dealer to draw us a card, release the tension into our hand. We're going to shoot the Searing Shot for 0. It's going to be for a total of 7 damage because it has the buff from Release the Tension. So 7 damage, and if we blocked with the other 3 cards, that's 9 value out of those, assuming they're all 3 blocks, hopefully. And this is going to give us a 16 damage turn cycle at the cost of 4 cards plus a tunic counter, or 4.33 cards if you want to count the tunic counter towards your valuation. So this leads to approximately about 4 value per card, of course. This is situational. It's always going to depend on what you draw off the top of your deck. If you draw an arrow, you could always arsenal it for next turn to try to get some value out of it that way. But if you draw a pump, you can just use it this turn and pump your arsenaled arrow. So 4 value per card is pretty good rate. I think the aggro decks are always looking for 4 value per card. Azalea is a little bit more mid-range because she likes to block and then send out disruptive arrows. So with this valuation set, we're going to look at the Sandscour Greatbow next. With Sandscour Greatbow, there's 3 different things to analyze: how often you can get arrows off the top of your deck, how often you can get aim counters, and how much value those aim counters are worth. Death Dealer is a very straightforward action. You're loading an arrow and drawing a card, but Sandscour Greatbow has a couple more hoops to jump through. I'll refresh how it works. You can pay 1 resource and look at the top card of your deck. If it's an arrow, you can put it into Arsenal, or you can put an arrow from hand into Arsenal if it's not an arrow. And if you ever put a card into Arsenal face up from your deck, specifically, you get to put an aim counter on it. So if you top deck an arrow with Azalea's ability instead of Sandscour Greatbow, where you put your Arsenal to the bottom and put an arrow from top, it face up into Arsenal, that will also give you an aim counter, even though you didn't use Sandscour Greatbow. So of the 3 things I said, the first I'm going to look at is the top deck arrow rate, and this is going to vary from deck to deck, as well as with what mechanics you're including in your deck. If you're using cross wrap, that's going to obviously help you top deck arrows more often because you have access to opt every turn. You can also add in cards that opt into your deck, like Read the Glide Path and even Eye of Ophidia. But of all of these things, your specific deck is going to help you determine how often you can get an arrow off the top. The reason this is important is because with Sandscour Greatbow, we don't just draw a card every single time we activate it, but when we do put an arrow from the top of our deck into our arsenal, that's functionally like drawing a card. Every time you top deck is pretty much the same as 1 Death Dealer load, and if somehow you can get your deck to top deck arrows 100% of the time, that means if you have the aim mechanic and you're using it often, Greatbow is just going to be strictly better than Death Dealer. That's probably controversial because they have different play patterns, and drawing a card into your hand means that you can pitch it or do something else with it, rather than with Sandscour Greatbow, it has to be an arrow and it has to go into Arsenal. But I do think it's important to note that maximizing the top deck arrow rate is going to get Greatbow closer and closer to on rate with Death Dealer. The next thing we're going to look at is the value of aim counters. With aim counters, they don't have an inherent aspect to them. They don't say whenever there's an aim counter on your arrow, do something specific. It's going to vary from arrow to arrow. So I have 2 arrows here. One is Longshot and one is Hemorrhage Bore. When Longshot has an aim counter on it, it has +2 damage. And when Hemorrhage Bore has an aim counter on it, it's basically a Command and Conquer 1 for 5. So there's 2 different valuations here. I'm going to look at Longshot first. And you might be tempted to say on Longshot an aim counter is just straight up worth 2 damage. But the thing is, 0 for 3 is a below rate attack, unfortunately, especially given that it doesn't have Go again. So given that 0 for 4 is the best rate you're looking for and on in an average rate without go again, I'm actually only valuing aim counters on long shot as 1 point of damage because you really don't want to be shooting long shot without an aim counter anyways. With hemorrhage bore, it doesn't add damage or a for sure effect, but it does add an on hit effect. And on hit effects are very valuable. You can force your opponent to block your card, or if you have activated Dominate with Azalea and you force the card to hit, your opponent loses an entire card from Arsenal. So the best case scenario with hemorrhage bore is that it has an aim counter and it does hit, and your opponent loses an entire card from that, meaning that the card you spent, hemorrhage bore, is refunded, but you still get the 5 damage because your opponent lost their card. And depending on the aim counter arrows that you include in your deck, the value is going to range anywhere from 1 damage all the way up to 1 card, and it's especially going to be scenario specific. And you can't discount the fact that if your opponent did block it, they were forced to block with those cards that they may really want to have to attack with them, especially if they were 2 block cards. If you force your opponent to block with a 2 block card, you force them to get 2 value out of their card instead of the full 3 on block, or 4 if they were to attack with it, or even more. Like if it was a 5 and they were going to get 5 value per card on their turn, you stopped a lot of damage. Even though you may not leak anything, forcing blocks is a really strong mechanic. The last thing we're going to look at for Sandscour Greatbow of these 3 categories is free aim counters and how often you're getting them. Of course, every time you top deck an arrow with Greatbow, you're going to get an aim counter from it, but you can also get aim counters off of top decking with Azalea's ability, so you don't even have to pay for the Greatbow to do that. So you're going to want to include things like Read the Glide Path in your deck to opt. I would also suggest looking at Skullbone Crosswrap. A lot of Azaleas are already running this. Levi, who got top 8 at a Battle Hardened with Azalea, was running it. Go check out his video on Spark of Genius. They have a really good deck tech on it. But Skullbone Crosswrap is super strong already in Azalea, and being able to make sure you're getting free aim counters more often because you're opting and getting top deck arrows more often is going to be really powerful. So definitely when you're building a deck around this, analyze how often you can actually get the aim counters and figure out if it's going to be worth to build a deck around this or go back to a more traditional Death Dealer build. The last thing I'm going to show you guys is this graph that I made that compares Sandscour Greatbow activations with Death Dealer activations, and sees how often you have to top deck an arrow in order to get value out of Greatbow that you otherwise would have gotten for free off of Death Dealer without having to worry about whether your top deck is an arrow or not. So this graph has 2 things: how often your arrow is on top of your deck, as well as how much value an aim counter is. So when you're looking at this graph, if you value an aim counter at around 1/3 of a card, if you're just getting 1 damage off of it, for example, every single time, you actually need to be top decking an arrow almost 75% of the time to be on par with Death Dealer activations. This graph doesn't take into account anytime you get a free arrow off of Azalea's ability, so this is going to be skewed down a little bit. But if you land right here, you're on par with Death Dealer activations. I'll show really quick for those who are interested how I made this graph, and it's just with looking at scenarios in my head between Greatbow activations and Death Dealer activations. So with Death Dealer, every single time you activate it, it costs 1 resource. Same with Greatbow, so we're not going to look at resource when you're comparing the two. With Death Dealer, you get a full card off of it every single time. So if you activate it 3 times, you're going to get 3 full cards off of it. With Greatbow, when you activate it, you only get a full card off of it when the top of your deck is an arrow, but it does also give you an aim counter. So if your aim counter is worth 0.5 of a card, then you're getting 1.5 on 1 activation. The next time you activate it, if the top of your deck is not an arrow, you're going to get 0. And then if you activate it again and do hit an arrow, you're going to get 1.5 value again. And this ends up over 3 turns, accruing you 3 cards worth of value. So we can see Greatbow has to hit 2/3 of the time if your aim counters are worth 0.5 on average to be on par with Death Dealer activations. That's why we can see the aim counter value at 0.5 over here lines up with about 0.66 on this graph. Just to go through this exercise one more time to show the curve of the graph is accurate, if your aim counter is worth a whole card, every time you top deck an arrow, you're going to get 2 cards worth of value. 1 card from the aim counter and 1 card from the activation. And if you do miss, you're going to get 0 cards worth of value. That lines up with activating Death Dealer twice. This means if your aim counter is worth 100% of a card, your arrow on top rate only has to be 50%. If you go through and build your deck and you do some analysis on how often you're hitting these values, if your aim counter value is a certain average and your arrow on top rate is a certain percent, if you land above this in this section, then you're going to be getting more value out of Greatbow than you would have been getting out of Death Dealer. Of course, like I said earlier, this doesn't take into account often you're getting free aim counters. There are cards that give aim counters, and you can get aim counters off Azalea, so you should adjust it a little bit. You may be on the line or a little bit below the line, but still be better than Azalea, because aim counter effects sometimes can be very strong. Like the card we showed earlier, where if you have an aim counter, you're basically a command and conquer. That's clearly a very strong effect. Forcing blocks is very good. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these values. I hope you guys found this interesting. I was definitely really interested in looking at Sandscour Greatbow. This analysis really looks at the numbers and looks at the activations themselves, but you definitely need to dive a lot deeper into looking at play patterns and how this is going to influence the way you play and the way you build your deck. So I hope this basic look at the introduction of Greatbow is helpful to you guys in building your decks. And I hope you have fun with it. Let us know in the comments what other cards you want us to analyze and what game mechanics and strategies that we could look at and talk about in future videos. As always, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you're not, and we'll see you next time.